Every poor man's favorite budget meals in the Depression era weren't just scraps on a plate, they were lifelines families came to love. These budget meals turned flour, potatoes, and garden greens into comfort that carried people through hard times. What hidden lessons still linger in those recipes? Cabbage roll. Casserole was one of those Depression-era meals that made the most of scraps while still delivering real comfort to the table. Instead of carefully rolling leaves around bits of rice or meat, families would simply layer chopped cabbage with leftover grains, stale bread, and whatever scraps of vegetables they had. Sometimes there was even a small amount of ground pork or beef mixed in, though most of the time the casserole relied on stretching every flavor from the scraps themselves. A little vinegar or tomato juice added tang and moisture, while onions gave it a base of flavor. Once it baked, the entire dish came together into something hearty enough to serve a large family for very little money. The casserole was a dish that spoke to both ingenuity and the realities of the time, because not everyone could spare hours or meat for proper cabbage rolls. Layering scraps turned survival cooking into something close to celebration. Rolled oat meatloaf was another way people made do when meat was a rare luxury during the Depression era. The idea was simple. Oats were cheap, filling, and easy to find, so they became the backbone of many loaves when ground beef was scarce. Housewives would combine rolled oats with onion, a little broth or tomato juice, and perhaps an egg if one could be spared, then bake it until firm. The oats took on the flavor of the few seasonings and drippings that were used, giving the illusion of meat even if very little was present. If there was any beef or pork to add, it stretched further thanks to the bulk of the oats. Served with gravy made from pan drippings or even a thin tomato sauce, it could feel hearty enough to pass for the real thing. Many families came to appreciate the flavor and comfort it provided, even without meat. Cabbage core slaw proved that absolutely nothing went to waste in the Depression era. While most people today throw away the tough core of a cabbage, thrifty families of the 1930s shaved it finely to make a crunchy salad. With vinegar, a little sugar, and maybe a pinch of salt, it transformed into something tangy and surprisingly refreshing. Carrots or onions, if available, might be added for color and flavor, but often it was just the cabbage core itself. It became a side dish for meals that otherwise would have been too plain or heavy, adding brightness without any real cost. This slaw was a simple reminder that waste was not an option, and even what many considered garbage could become a dish worth serving. Families learned to enjoy the sharp taste and crunchy bite, and for some it even became a regular part of the dinner table. Corncob jelly was one of the most surprising Depression-era creations, turning what was usually discarded into something sweet and useful. After eating or cutting kernels from corn, families would boil the stripped cobs for a long time until the liquid turned golden. With sugar and sometimes pectin, this liquid became a jelly that spread easily on bread or biscuits. It had a mild corn flavor, slightly sweet, and it gave people a way to stretch ingredients without buying fruit for jams. Since sugar was often rationed or expensive, this jelly was seen as a clever way to create a sweet treat out of nothing more than scraps. Many families remembered it fondly, not only because it was thrifty, but because it represented resourcefulness at its finest. Children often spread it on cornbread or stale bread softened in milk, turning waste into dessert. It may seem odd today, but back then it was pure ingenuity. Peanut soup was a filling option that came straight out of the need for protein when meat was too expensive or unavailable. Ground peanuts simmered with water or milk created a creamy, nutty broth that was surprisingly hearty. Onions, celery, or a bit of leftover potato might be added to give it body, but the peanuts did most of the heavy lifting. The flavor was rich enough that it almost felt indulgent, even though it cost very little to prepare. Served with cornbread or biscuits if available, it could stretch into a complete meal for an entire family. Many households in the South relied on peanuts as a cheap crop, and this soup was a natural way to put them to use. For many children who grew up during the Depression, peanut soup became a nostalgic memory of warmth and survival, showing how simple ingredients could stand in for things they could not afford. Ketchup sandwiches may sound like a joke today, but in the Depression era, they were a quick meal for children and adults alike. With meat out of reach for many, A slice of bread spread thin with ketchup became lunch or even dinner. The tangy, sweet flavor gave the illusion of something more filling, especially when paired with a second slice of bread. Sometimes butter or margarine was added if available, but most of the time it was just bread and ketchup. While humble, it provided calories when little else was around, and children often looked forward to it simply because it tasted different from the usual plain bread. It was also portable, making it an easy option for workers or school lunches. Though it might not sound appetizing now, it kept hunger away for countless families. For many who grew up in the 1930s, ketchup sandwiches became an unforgettable part of their childhood survival. Pot liquor with cornbread was a Southern tradition that became a Depression-era favorite because it stretched nothing into something filling. Pot liquor was the nutrient-rich broth left over after boiling greens like collards, turnip tops, or mustard greens. Instead of throwing it away, families would crumble cornbread into the liquid and eat it like a soup. It was packed with vitamins and minerals, even if it cost almost nothing to make. For poor families, it was a way to turn scraps into a full meal. It also carried a sense of comfort, with the familiar flavors of the greens and the cornbread blending together into something that felt substantial. Often it was eaten for dinner when nothing else was left in the pantry, but it still provided strength and nourishment. Many remembered it fondly as both survival food and comfort food, proving that even the simplest things could be cherished. Cucumber vinegar salad was a refreshing Depression-era side dish that added brightness to otherwise plain meals. Cucumbers were easy to grow in home gardens, and when combined with vinegar, water, and a pinch of sugar or salt, they became a simple but flavorful salad. Thinly sliced and chilled if possible, the cucumbers soaked up the tangy brine and provided crunch. For families living on beans, bread, and potatoes, this salad was a welcome change in texture and taste. It required almost no cooking, which was another benefit when fuel and time were scarce. Often served in large bowls at supper, it gave the sense of a fresh vegetable dish without requiring expensive ingredients. Sometimes onions or dill were added, but the core recipe was basic and thrifty. For many households, cucumber vinegar salad was a reminder that gardening and resourcefulness could provide something close to luxury in the hardest times. Potato rarebit was one of the Depression's clever ways to make potatoes feel more special than they were. The base idea was to take mashed or sliced potatoes and top them with a thin sauce of cheese, milk, and spices. Cheese was often scarce, so the sauce was made with very small amounts stretched as far as possible, sometimes even flavored with mustard to give it more punch. The result was a dish that felt rich and indulgent, even though it used little more than potatoes and scraps of cheese. Families would bake or broil it to give the top a golden crust, making it even more appealing. It was filling, cheap, and versatile, perfect for serving a large family. Children especially loved when potatoes got transformed this way, since it was a rare chance to enjoy something creamy and flavorful. Potato rarebit may not be common today, but it was beloved back then. Stewed apples with bread cubes was a dessert that stretched every bit of fruit to its fullest during the Depression. A few apples, sometimes bruised or close to spoiling, were peeled and stewed with sugar or molasses if available. To make the dish go further, stale bread cubes were added to soak up the syrupy juices. The result was a warm, comforting pudding-like dish that could serve several people with only a handful of apples. Spices like cinnamon or nutmeg might be added when they could be spared, but even without them, the dish was sweet and filling. For many children, this was the closest thing to pie they would taste during those years. It turned waste into dessert and brought comfort at the end of long days. Even though it cost next to nothing, it felt like a treat worth remembering. Stewed apples with bread cubes showed how creativity kept hope alive. Mock banana pudding was the sort of dish that showed just how inventive Depression-era cooks could be when real ingredients were simply out of reach. Bananas, once imported luxuries, quickly became too expensive for families to buy. To make up for it, people leaned on banana extract, which could be purchased cheaply and used sparingly to add flavor, layered with homemade custard, when eggs and milk could be spared, and stacked between vanilla wafers or leftover bits of stale cake. The pudding felt surprisingly close to the original. Families would chill it in an icebox if they had one, though often it was served warm right from the stove. For children, it was a rare treat that offered the illusion of a fruit dessert, even if no fresh fruit was present. In many homes, mock banana pudding became a stand-in for celebration desserts, stretching scarce supplies into something families could still enjoy together, and for many, it carried the sweetness of hope itself. Boiled turnip tops were a staple born of necessity, proving that even the green leaves most people might throw away could keep families alive. Turnips were affordable, hardy vegetables that grew well in poor soil, and when their roots were harvested, the greens were never wasted. Women would wash and boil the tops in a simple pot of water, sometimes seasoning only with a pinch of salt if they had it. The greens cooked down into a soft, bitter but nutritious dish that helped fill stomachs when nothing else was available. Occasionally, if there was bacon fat or lard to spare, the leaves would be flavored more richly, but most of the time it was plain boiled greens. Children often disliked the taste, but parents insisted, knowing the vitamins were essential in years when fresh vegetables were rare. For many rural households, boiled turnip tops became a daily food, reminding them of how survival depended on using every single part of the harvest. Carrot marmalade was a sweet spread that helped families feel like they had something luxurious for breakfast, even in the toughest years of the Depression. Sugar was precious, but when it could be managed, grated carrots simmered down with citrus peel made a bright orange jam that tasted far richer than its ingredients suggested. Citrus itself was not always available, so many recipes leaned heavily on the carrots, using peel or extract when possible. The finished marmalade was thick, fragrant, and easily spread across homemade bread or crackers, turning simple staples into something that felt festive. Children loved its sweetness, and parents appreciated how it stretched a handful of carrots into enough jam to last for several mornings. Many community cookbooks published carrot marmalade recipes, encouraging families to rely on what they could grow in gardens. It was a dish that turned scarcity into creativity, and for many households it became a small comfort that brightened otherwise plain and repetitive meals. Homemade crackers were one of the simplest yet most practical foods people baked during the Depression. With store-bought crackers and snacks out of the question, families turned to flour, water, and a pinch of salt or lard to make thin crisps. Rolled flat and baked until golden, they provided crunch and variety in a diet that was otherwise dominated by soft, starchy foods. Often, children would snack on them plain, while adults used them to stretch soups, broths, and thin stews. They could be topped with whatever was on hand, from drippings to a smear of carrot marmalade, but even alone they were satisfying in their simplicity. Families appreciated how they required little fuel and ingredients, and they became a staple for households that could not afford bread every day. Homemade crackers reflected resilience, showing how even the most basic pantry items could be transformed into something useful. They were not glamorous, but they were dependable, which is exactly what people needed most. Dandelion coffee was one of the many substitutes that appeared when coffee beans were either unavailable or unaffordable. Families would dig up dandelion roots, roast them carefully until dark, and grind them into a coarse powder. When brewed, the result resembled coffee in both color and aroma, though the flavor carried a bitter earthiness all its own. For those accustomed to real coffee, it was not quite the same, but it became a daily ritual that provided both warmth and comfort in lean times. Children and adults alike drank it, often with a little sugar or milk if available to soften the bitterness. Because dandelions were free and abundant, the drink spread widely in both rural and urban areas. It symbolized the Depression's spirit of using whatever nature offered, even weeds, to replace expensive imports. For many families, dandelion coffee was not just a beverage, but a reminder that comfort could still be found in the simplest, most overlooked places. Rutabaga hash was a clever dish that made the most of rutabagas, which were cheaper and more plentiful than potatoes during the Depression. Families would chop the firm root into small cubes, frying it with onions and whatever fat they could find. The rutabaga softened and browned, giving a texture and taste that mimicked potatoes closely enough to satisfy hungry families. Sometimes scraps of bacon or ham were added for flavor, but more often it was just the vegetables alone. The hash was hearty, filling, and adaptable, often appearing at both breakfast and dinner tables. Since rutabagas grew well in harsh conditions, they were dependable crops when potatoes ran short. Many children grew up not realizing their parents had been serving them substitutes because the crispy fried cubes tasted so much like the real thing. Rutabaga hash showed how families made necessity feel normal, turning cheap vegetables into meals that could carry them through some of the hardest years in memory. Breaded tomato slices were a Depression-era favorite when green or underripe tomatoes were all that gardens could spare. Rather than waste them, families would slice the tomatoes thick, dip them in a little cornmeal or flour, and fry them until golden. The result was crisp on the outside, tangy inside, and surprisingly satisfying. Sometimes salt or pepper was added, but often they were served plain, still managing to feel like a treat in households where luxuries were rare. This dish became especially popular in rural areas where families grew their own produce and needed creative ways to use every part of the harvest. Children enjoyed the crunch, and adults valued how it stretched a small supply of vegetables into something filling. Breaded tomato slices became both a side dish and sometimes even a main meal, depending on how scarce other foods were. They reflected both thrift and resourcefulness, proving that even unripe produce could be transformed into comfort food. Mock fish cakes were a thrifty invention for families who longed for seafood but could not afford it during the Depression. Instead of fish, mashed beans or leftover potatoes were seasoned with onions and herbs, then shaped into patties and fried. When browned in a pan, they resembled fish cakes in both texture and appearance, providing the illusion of a more expensive meal. Families often relied on beans because they were cheap, nutritious, and available through relief programs, making them the perfect base for this dish. Some households even added breadcrumbs or stale crackers to stretch the mixture further. While it might not have carried the same flavor as real fish, it was filling and hearty, which mattered most in those years. For many children, mock fish cakes became a familiar supper, remembered later with a mix of humor and nostalgia. They embodied the era's spirit of improvisation, turning simple, humble ingredients into something that felt like a substitute for luxury. Oatmeal. Gruel was one of the humblest Depression foods, often reserved for children, the elderly, or the sick. Rolled oats were boiled in water until thin and soupy, sometimes flavored with milk if it could be spared, or a sprinkle of sugar when available. It lacked richness, but it was nourishing and easy to digest, which made it practical when stronger meals were impossible. For many families, oatmeal gruel was served as both breakfast and dinner, stretching a handful of oats across several bowls. Though plain, it provided much-needed energy and warmth in a time when calories were hard to come by. Parents ate less of it themselves, saving portions for their children. While it might not have been anyone's favorite meal, it carried the comfort of something warm in otherwise hungry days. For countless households, oatmeal gruel was both a symbol of hardship and proof of how people endured with the simplest foods. Pickled watermelon rinds turned what many would throw away into a sweet, sour preserve that families treasured during the Depression. When fresh fruit was too precious to waste, thrifty homemakers saved the tough white rind of watermelons. These rinds were boiled with sugar, vinegar, and spices until they softened and took on a tangy sweetness. Stored in jars, they became both a condiment and a dessert, brightening up otherwise bland meals. Children loved them for their unexpected flavor, and adults valued how nothing went to waste. Victory gardens often produced watermelons, and in households where money was scarce, even the rinds had value. Pickled watermelon rinds were served alongside beans, bread, or meats when they could be found, making ordinary meals feel more lively. Many families kept recipes for these preserves, passing them down as reminders of how every scrap could be used. The dish was both resourceful and flavorful, embodying the resilience that defined Depression-era cooking. Cornmeal dumplings in broth were one of those Depression-era tricks that turned the most modest soup into something that felt like a meal. Flour and wheat were often expensive, but cornmeal remained relatively cheap and widely available. Families would mix cornmeal with water and a little salt to form a simple dough, shaping it into small balls and dropping them into a pot of thin broth. The broth itself could be made from vegetable scraps, meat bones, or even just salted water, but once the dumplings simmered and swelled, the dish felt hearty. Mothers often relied on this trick to stretch a single pot into enough servings for large families. Children loved the dumplings because they had a soft, chewy texture, almost like a treat floating in their soup. Adults valued the filling quality, which helped stave off hunger when no second helpings were possible. Cornmeal dumplings showed the ingenuity of turning something inexpensive and basic into comfort food. In many households, this dish became a staple, remembered later not for its luxury, but for the way it managed to make empty cupboards feel just a little less empty. Molasses water was one of the simplest Depression-era energy boosters, and it carried a surprising amount of cultural weight. White sugar was often scarce and costly, but molasses was cheaper and packed with minerals like iron, which people desperately needed. Families would stir a spoonful of molasses into a glass of water, creating a sweet, dark drink that was both energizing and inexpensive. Children drank it before heading to school, and workers often relied on it to get through long hours of labor. It tasted strong, sometimes too strong for delicate palates, but its sweetness made it more welcome than plain water. Molasses water was also used as a quick fix when other drinks like milk or coffee were out of reach. For many rural families, it became a symbol of thrift and nourishment, stretching the value of every ingredient. It was not a luxury or even a treat. It was a necessity, one that reminded people of the importance of resourcefulness. In its simplicity, molasses water reflects how people created sustenance out of almost nothing and carried on despite hardship. Stuffed beet leaves showed how Depression kitchens wasted nothing, not even the leafy tops of common root vegetables. Instead of throwing the greens away, families boiled them briefly to soften and then filled them with small portions of rice, breadcrumbs, or leftover scraps of vegetables. Rolled tightly, they resembled stuffed grape leaves, though much humbler in taste and presentation. Sometimes onions or herbs were added if available, but most of the time they were seasoned simply with salt or vinegar. This dish was especially popular in rural homes where beet crops were plentiful and gardens were a lifeline. Stuffed beet leaves carried a sense of novelty for children who might otherwise turn up their noses at plain greens. Adults valued them for stretching scraps into something that looked and felt more like a real meal. Even in their simplicity, they managed to bring variety to dinner tables that often repeated the same foods day after day. They remain a forgotten reminder of how every single part of a plant had value when survival depended on it. Rice croquettes were a Depression trick for turning yesterday's leftovers into something new and appetizing. When rice was cooked in large batches, families often had more than they could finish, and waste was simply not an option. Leftover rice was mashed together with a bit of flour or egg when available, then shaped into small balls and fried in a skillet with fat or drippings. The result was a golden, crispy outside and a soft, chewy inside that children especially loved. Adults appreciated how croquettes added texture and flavor to meals that were otherwise bland. They could be served with gravy, broth, or just eaten plain, offering flexibility depending on what was on hand. In some households, croquettes became the centerpiece of dinner when no meat was available. They proved that resourcefulness in the kitchen could transform scraps into something enjoyable. Families remembered rice croquettes not just as a thrifty dish, but as a rare moment when leftovers felt special instead of repetitive. They were simple, but in hard times, simplicity was often the best comfort of all. Apple peel jelly was the perfect example of Depression frugality, showing how even scraps could become something sweet. When apples were peeled for pies or other dishes, thrifty homemakers saved the skins rather than discarding them. These peels were boiled with sugar and water, sometimes with a bit of lemon peel, until they turned into a flavorful jelly. The jelly could be spread over bread, crackers, or biscuits, instantly brightening the table. It was not as rich as traditional jams, but for families who had little, it felt like a luxury. Children loved the sweet tang, and parents took pride in knowing nothing went to waste. Apple peel jelly was especially popular in rural areas where orchards were common, and every harvest meant piles of peels waiting to be reused. For families struggling through hunger, it was a reminder that comfort could be coaxed from even the most unlikely ingredients. It became both a necessity and a tradition, keeping hope alive through sweetness. Salted popcorn supper might sound like a snack today, but during the Depression it often stood in for a real meal. Popcorn was inexpensive, easy to make in large quantities, and filling enough to take the edge off hunger. Families would pop big bowls of it, sprinkle salt over the top, and gather around to share it for dinner. While it lacked the nutrition of meat or vegetables, it was a warm, shared experience that brought families together. Children saw it as a treat, while adults knew it was simply necessity disguised as fun. Sometimes popcorn was paired with milk or molasses water to add substance, but often it stood on its own. Neighbors also used popcorn suppers at gatherings, stretching limited food to feed a crowd. The dish represents how families redefined what supper meant when resources were at their lowest. It was proof that even the humblest food could provide comfort when eaten together, turning scarcity into moments of connection and shared resilience. Milk toast was one of the humblest but most beloved comfort foods of the Depression. Families would toast slices of bread, often stale or homemade, and soak them in warm milk flavored with sugar or a pinch of salt. The softened bread took on a custard-like texture that children especially enjoyed, while adults valued its warmth and simplicity. Milk toast was often served for breakfast or supper when cupboards were bare, providing a soothing, filling option that used ingredients most homes had on hand. It was easy to digest, which also made it a common food for the elderly and the sick. In households where milk was scarce, families watered it down, making it stretch further while still preserving the spirit of the dish. Milk toast was never glamorous, but it carried the weight of familiarity and comfort, reminding people that even the plainest foods could feel nurturing. It is remembered today not for extravagance, but for the quiet reassurance it gave in the hardest times. Vegetable scrap. Broth was a dish that truly embodied Depression-era thrift. Onion skins, carrot tops, potato peels, celery ends, and even wilted greens were all collected in a pot. Boiled with water and sometimes flavored with a pinch of salt or herbs, these scraps produced a thin but flavorful broth. Families drank it plain or used it as a base for dumplings, bread, or rice. Though light, it delivered warmth and the illusion of variety when true variety was scarce. Mothers often saved scraps throughout the week to ensure nothing was wasted, turning what others might throw away into life-sustaining meals. Children may not have loved it, but they drank it because there were no alternatives. The broth was proof of resourcefulness, showing that even scraps could keep hunger at bay. For many households, it was a survival staple, and the memory of scrap broth lingered as a reminder of how every bit of food mattered in those lean years. Radish sandwiches were a common rural Depression-era meal born of the simplest garden ingredients. Bread was often homemade, and radishes were among the easiest vegetables to grow quickly. Thin slices of radish were salted and layered between two pieces of bread, making a sharp, peppery sandwich that cost next to nothing. Sometimes butter or lard was spread on the bread if available, but often it was just radishes and salt. Children sometimes found the taste too strong, but adults appreciated the freshness and crunch. These sandwiches were portable, cheap, and filling enough to be eaten in the fields or at school. Families often remembered them not as a treat, but as a symbol of survival, proof that even the humblest vegetables had value. Radish sandwiches may have been plain, but they were deeply tied to the memory of Depression-era gardens and the resilience they represented. They carried with them the taste of both hardship and hope. Prune whip was one of the Depression's simplest yet most surprising desserts. Prunes, being affordable and long-lasting, became a pantry staple, especially in rural areas. To make prune whip, stewed prunes were mashed and folded into whipped egg whites, creating a fluffy, airy dessert that felt far richer than its ingredients suggested. Sweetened with a little sugar if available, it became a favorite treat for children who rarely saw sweets at all. Parents valued it for stretching a small amount of fruit into enough dessert for the whole family. Served in bowls or even glasses, prune whip looked fancy, adding a sense of celebration to otherwise plain meals. It was often reserved for Sundays or special occasions, giving families something to look forward to. Though forgotten today, Prune whip symbolized Depression-era ingenuity, turning a single affordable fruit into a dessert that carried joy. In the toughest of years, it proved that even hardship could be softened with sweetness. Spiedis are also something you would find at gatherings for family or just friends, mostly because no party is complete without a good platter of meat skewers going around a few drinks. So, mostly people would enjoy these most when the meat was lamb, but some areas like California would use chicken or beef too. It was really the grilling where the magic happened. These plates of Spiedis set the mood in a party alight. It was a taste that, when they experienced it, people at a party knew that they were in for a really good time. The kind of dish that gets a crowd excited and hungry. There were even Spiedefests in Binghamton and all around New York in general. It was a part of the local culture that no big celebration was really complete without. The reason it got popular wasn't just because of a regional preference in New York, though. The dish was bold, tangy, and citrusy, and it could double as an amazing sandwich too. You would find these in street stalls throughout New York, as well as at homes, but nowadays the dish has faded away into irrelevance. You might think that boiled animal hooves are something that only a survivalist would eat, and indeed, during the Dust Bowl, they were the only thing keeping some families going. When meat became unaffordable and gelatin packets were a luxury, hooves came in handy, literally and metaphorically. Animal hooves, preferably cow or pig, were used and boiled to make a broth that was as useful and as ugly sounding as it can get in our ears today. The long cooking process tenderized collagen present in hooves and made it into a natural binder for soups, stews, and even sweets. Yes, you heard it correctly, desserts. Gelatin from hooves was the secret behind the wobble in aspics, jellies, and custards. This was not about getting by. It was about getting the most out of each part of the animal. Hooves cooked were a rich source of protein and minerals and were a great food source during the lean periods. And even though they were not the most attractive, they ensured that bellies were filled and bodies were built. Today, such concepts as boiling hooves may cause some people to have goosebumps. However, in those days, it was business as usual. Dust Bowl meals were about subsistence, and at times, subsistence entails getting creative with what is available, or hoof. Pancakes and cutlets were not the only comfort cooking people made out of the vegetable we just talked about because it is oh so resourceful. Potato soup was also a regular item at the top of the menu. People would usually use whatever basic vegetables they had to make the soup more varied, but even potatoes, some grounded black pepper and water went fine. Typically, though, people would barter for a few onions or carrots to spice the soup up for special occasions or when it had been a while since they had their last good bowl of hot soup. Especially in the winters, when people needed nutrition more than ever. In about 25 minutes, you had yourself a quality and healthy meal that kept your energy going for all the labor of the week. This recipe really made a name for itself during the mid-1930s to 40s when people were facing a dire shortage of eggs. Still, if you did not have even some potatoes on hand but still wanted a pancake to cheer your kids up, you would go for eggless pancakes. Some shortening, sugar, milk, and salt were all you needed to make this version of the beloved American dish, plus just some water to bind if you could not find any milk to spare. Lucky were the homes that had lard, as that really made for some fluffy and thick cakes, but complaining was not really something people did during those times. A simple recipe like this let them revisit the taste of pancakes from back when they had fully stocked fridges, after all. Another meatless option, lima bean and peanut loaf, was a creative way to get your protein during the Depression. It's made by combining cooked lima beans, peanut butter, and breadcrumbs to form a loaf. The result was a savory loaf with a nutty flavor and a satisfying texture. It was an excellent meatless option for families looking to stretch their food budget. Plus, it was a great way to use up leftover beans and peanuts, ensuring nothing went to waste. Lima bean loaf allegedly tastes a bit like falafel, but is best with lots of highly seasoned gravy. This dish might sound a bit unusual, But it was a creative solution to a common problem: getting enough protein without emptying their pockets. You hear the name rumaki and you might start thinking about some pretty exotic dishes, but it's actually more of a humble appetizer that picks a few flavors and does them really, really well. It was also made at Trader Vic's, a Polynesian-style restaurant right here in Uncle Sam's USA, which I'm sure you didn't see coming either. I wouldn't blame you for thinking it's exotic, since at tiki parties it was definitely considered that, and when tiki culture as a whole started erupting into the mainstream of American eating, it was still sought after, with just as much interest. The dish itself also makes use of some things that aren't familiar, and some that are, like chicken livers, water chestnuts, and bacon. It was a really good hors d'oeuvre that boomed in popularity after the World War II era, though you'd be pretty stumped if you tried to go out and look for it today. Still, it's kind of sad we can't go out to parties and experience chestnuts and crispy bacon anymore, wouldn't you agree? Or is tiki cooking not really up your alley? Adage. If you believe that eating insects is a modern, sustainable practice, you are wrong. In the Dust Bowl, crispy fried grasshoppers were not a joke. They were a staple food. During the poor harvests, and when meat was hard to come by, farmers looked to the hordes of grasshoppers feeding on the crops. Talk about revenge dining. Hunting grasshoppers was a family event, and when you had gathered enough grasshoppers in a bucket, then the cooking process started. They were washed, marinated, and then fried to a crisp golden brown. The result? A crunchy snack that contained protein and was not too shabby if one didn't consider what they were consuming. Grasshoppers are in fact a form of superfood as they contain high protein, iron, and good fats. The Dust Bowl families were not consciously trying to innovate, but they were able to feed themselves in a way that many others could not. Also, if you fry anything, it automatically becomes at least 50% tastier, doesn't it? Nowadays, insects are being considered as a source of food, but in the past, crispy grasshoppers were a means of feeding oneself. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. Gelatin might seem like a strange ingredient for a savory dish, but it was commonly used during the Depression to stretch meat and add bulk to meals. Gelatin was a cheap, cutting-edge protein source in the 1930s, meaning it made its way into a lot of Depression-era cookbooks. Take corned beef luncheon salad, for example. It's a mix of canned corned beef, gelatin, canned peas, vinegar, and lemon juice. The dish was not a hit with culinary historian Jane Ziegelman, who described it as wrong in every way possible, just from the color to the smell, the texture, the flavor, and the way it feels in one's mouth. But it was all the rage back in the day. It might sound odd, but it was a popular way to use up leftovers. I don't need to tell you about how much America and the West in general love rice pudding. It's been something that's helped rural and urban populations get through some disastrously tough times, as well as a warm memory from childhood for a lot of people. One variation of the classic rice pudding was a Swedish rice ring, which would mostly be served at Christmas or a family get-together, but it eventually extended into daily use too. The dish first started off as something you'd only find in Scandinavian communities, and they'd really make heaps of the stuff. Enough to go around a big family of 6 or 8 with a bowl for each, and it makes sense too since it was made using some pretty average ingredients. Stuff like rice, milk, and cream were all you needed to get a Swedish rice ring going. The way it differed from normal rice pudding is in how the dish was originally always made with some kind of spice and topped with fruit or served alongside jam. Later on, when it expanded past the Scandinavian locale and got adopted into widespread use, people started using nutmeg and cinnamon as well. Some scant cookbooks might still recall the dish and the times where it was a great comfort meal, but a lot of the new ones don't really remember it anymore. What's for dinner? Oh, just a small something that came in from the backyard. Yes, the tumbleweed casserole was a real dish during the Dust Bowl, which just goes to show you that when the going gets tough, the tough make casseroles out of tumbleweeds. Tumbleweeds, those rolling shrubs of the Wild West screen, are actually technically, or at least partially, edible. Not fancy for the tongue, but we are hungry to the bone. Let's give it a try, edible. The process began with the boiling of the tumbleweed leaves to reduce their coarse feel and also to reduce the bitterness of the leaves. Then they'd get layered with whatever ingredients were available, maybe some scraps of meat, potatoes, or canned goods if you were lucky. The result? A surprisingly substantial, earthy-flavored casserole that was as much about sustenance as it was about taste. Tumbleweed is very fibrous and even has a few vitamins in it, so it wasn't the worst thing to eat when fresh greens were scarce. Moreover, tumbleweeds were free and easy to come by, nature's grocery store, if you will. Though you'll never see it on the dinner table. Tumbleweed casserole represents Dust Bowl endurance. Would I eat it? Well, I'd need a serious pep talk and a lot of seasoning. But hey, if the tumbleweed can take the hot winds, then it should not be a problem on my plate. When sugar and milk were scarce, cornstarch pudding became a popular dessert. It's a simple mixture of cornstarch, sugar, and milk, cooked until thickened. This creamy pudding was made with just a few basic ingredients: milk, sugar, cornstarch, and a pinch of salt. It was a quick and easy dessert that could be flavored with vanilla, chocolate, or even fruit extracts, depending on what you had on hand. Cornstarch pudding was a favorite because it was cheap, easy to make, and could be customized to suit different tastes. It was a comforting treat that provided a little sweetness during tough times. So, if you're in the mood for a simple, nostalgic dessert, whip up a batch of cornstarch pudding. Who knows? It might just hit the right spot. Speaking of those times, another really good source of protein was catfish, and one of the best ways to have it was fried catfish with hush puppies. This is again something that'll take us right to the heart of Southern cooking if we eat it. Along those rural places near rivers, lakes, ponds, and other bodies of water where you could find fresh catfish in abundance. Hush puppies were something made with fried cornmeal batter and were a popular dish to give to soldiers during the Civil War, so all in all, this dish was really light money-wise. Some basic Cajun spices or a Southern spice blend would make it even better into a real full-fledged meal that you could eat in comfort with the family. While it's been a big part of Southern cooking ever since the 19th century, it arguably had its biggest glory days in the 20th one as part of Southern soul food. There was a time in the 30s to 40s where soul food started to get into more and more menus across several places in the South, which wasn't always the case. Thank God it did, though, because steamed catfish definitely doesn't hit the spot quite like fried ones do with some golden brown hush puppies. If you always believed that only the drippings can be used to make gravy, then you are wrong. Blood gravy was a Dust Bowl staple that created a meal from the most unappetizing of ingredients, animal blood. Sound intense? It was. But back then, farmers couldn't afford to waste a single drop, literally. Blood gravy was produced by drawing fresh blood from animals, particularly pigs or cows, and then mixing it with flour, milk, and spices to make it into a thick paste that was served as a relish. Served over biscuits or potatoes, it was rather tasty and rich in nutrients, which came as a complete shock. During a period when people suffered from a lack of iron, blood gravy was, in fact, a sort of multivitamin. This dish was both a product of ingenuity and the expenditure of a considerable amount of effort. Getting the blood was not easy, but the meal was filling. For today's food lovers, it may be hard to swallow, but blood-based recipes are not something new to the culinary world since there is blood pudding from Sweden and dinuguan from the Philippines. Would you try it? Seriously, I can take it if it's presented on a fluffy biscuit, and if it's well seasoned, I might be willing to try it. Dust Bowl cooks were masters of turning nothing into something, and blood gravy is a perfect example of that. Cornmeal mush is usually made with water or milk and is a type of pudding or porridge depending on the needs of the meal. This became incredibly widespread in the southeastern and eastern bits of America, and it makes sense given how much wartime rations were consumed there. When the government would hand those out, they would often make a point to lower sugar usage and use molasses to conserve other ingredients, so people would pair cornmeal mush along with them. Mush is a more accurate term since it does kind of land somewhere in the middle ground between a pudding and a porridge. It has the consistency of the latter, but it gels and sets like the former, which gives it a slightly airy texture too. Did you know it would not be cooked in milk though? That was set after the mush was prepared to cool it down. Who would have thought that weeds could be a meal? Well, during the Great Depression, dandelion greens were a common sight on dinner tables. This vitamin-packed ingredient is foraged by Italian immigrant women in New York City. These bitter, leafy greens were rich in vitamins and minerals, making them a nutritious addition to any meal. People would often sauté the greens with a bit of bacon or lard, garlic, and onions to balance out the bitterness. They could also be used in salads or added to soups and stews. So, if you ever spot dandelions growing in your yard, remember that they're not just weeds. They're a delicious and nutritious green that can be enjoyed in a variety of ways. Just make sure they haven't been treated with any chemicals before you eat them. A name you might not hear very often in the cooking world, as far as French cuisine is concerned at least, is Marie-Antoine Carême, but you can thank her for some amazing dishes such as the vol au vent. This is actually something that got so popularized in American cookbooks in the mid-20th century. In the 1970s, when a national interest in foreign cooking really started popping off in America, there were a lot of trends centered around haute cuisine, and especially things you would find in premium French restaurants. In French-American communities, a vol au vent was a typical Saturday lunch that you would find being served up by your grandmother. Marie-Antoine Carême is a legendary French chef, and a reason she got that acclaim was because she managed to make up dishes that would suit the average household. Vol au vent is actually not really something you'd find at a five-star restaurant or on the upper end of what your wallet could afford. Most people would treat this like a party meal, something to serve at cocktail parties or New Year's ones. It was just puff pastry filled in with chicken, mushrooms, and creamy sauces, but it blended all of those together to make a really warm and earthy taste, which makes it perfectly suited to something you'd associate with your grandma's table. Yes, you heard it here first, skunk stew. Even when the Dust Bowl left dinner plates empty, people were not the only ones who could not escape being eaten, not even skunks. Now, before you start gagging, let me explain. Skunks were not the preferred source of protein, but when the resources were scarce, the farmers made do with whatever they could hunt down. Cooking skunk stew was not for the faint-hearted. First, you had to, de-skunk the skunk. It was mandatory to have the scent glands removed unless one wanted the house cleared faster than a tornado. After washing, it was cooked with what vegetables and spices were available. The result? A rather soft and gamey meal that was palatable though, but not one that would make me eagerly look forward to the next meal. Skunks may sound like the butt of some jokes, but these animals were a good source of protein food when all else was scarce. And can you imagine? A skunk was not as smelly as other wild games like raccoon or possum? Talk about a backhanded compliment. While skunk stew appears to be the epitome of the challenge-accepted food that is popular today for the survivors of the Dust Bowl, it was a symbol of survival. They made desperation into dinner. As they say, where there is life, there is a chance to live, and sometimes to live, you have to eat the wild, literally. Let's talk a little about snacking, shall we? So one very popular munch-heavy snack was biscuits that went along with this gravy made out of sausage drippings, and it actually enhanced the flavor more than you would think. Americans already ate a lot of biscuits before the Depression took place, but afterwards, they became a godsend. We are serious. Finding an extra biscuit was an entirely different experience in that era. Popular brands like the 1930s vintage car or the bourbon biscuit, Huntley and Palmer's, all kinds of biscuits that people could get their hands on were in hot demand since you would never know if dinner or breakfast was guaranteed. Best to bide your time with some biscuits in that case. If they come with a killer dip, then that silver lining shines just a bit brighter. Liver loaf might not sound appetizing, but it was a popular way to use up inexpensive liver during the Depression. It is a dish that might not be for everyone, but was an important source of nutrition during the tough days. The liver was one of the more affordable cuts of meat, and it was packed with essential nutrients. It's basically a meatloaf made with liver, mixed with breadcrumbs, onions, and spices. We'll add some carrots and celery for extra flavor and texture. It was often eaten as a main course, providing much-needed protein and iron. Food historians say that loaves were very popular during the Great Depression because they were made from an ingredient and a cheap thing that stretches the ingredient out. I know for a fact you've all grown up on some of your grandparents' baked ziti, especially if you have some Italian roots, and if you do, then you share that in common with this dish. Right from the streets of Italy, immigrants first brought this dish over in the middle of the 19th century throughout the early start of the 20th one, so it had a lot of time to become something that people could love and associate with the finer things in life. People had a lot of time by the mid-20th century to try this dish, and plenty of families had passed their own secret baked ziti recipes down. The baked ziti really hit its highest highs during that time period in the 1950s to the 1970s, and it was something you could enjoy at both a potluck and a fancy-at-home date. It was a staple of Italian-American cooking, and you could even find it at weddings. I, for one, think that really speaks to how popular the dish was, but what's your experience with this dish? And if you don't have any yet, is it something you'd ever try out? Potatoes had more use than just what was under all the layers. Once peeled, people would often fry the potato skins as a midday snack. Nothing would ever go to waste in homes back then, as you must have gathered by now. If they can make stuff out of sausage drippings and drain the fat from bacon to reuse, frying up some potato skins does not seem that out of the box at all. These fried skins were the perfect sidekick to potato pancakes, and the fact that the skins had a lot of health benefits made it all the more appealing. Things like this really helped to keep appetites in check, and that meant that the financial situation of the home would be calmer too. The Great Depression might not have the most appetizing recipes, but the era did give the world the Kraft macaroni and cheese dinner. In 1937, Kraft heard about a salesman for the Tenderoni Macaroni Company of St. Louis going rogue and selling his noodles with packets of Kraft grated cheese attached. They hired the man to promote the concept and started selling it to cash-strapped Americans at the low price of 19 cents for 4 servings. Some variations of this comfort food even included cooked vegetables or even a can of tuna. It was a great way to feed the family without spending a lot of money, and it quickly became a favorite for kids and adults alike. Even today, it remains a beloved comfort food. Green tomato pie is something that'll have you running back for seconds. First off, you gotta hand it to whoever made this dish for their ingenuity. It's not every day you get a banger of a dish that actually is centered around making the green tomato shine out of everything else. But Southern home cooking will do that for you. Charlotte's green tomato pie in particular makes use of some typical Southern spices like cinnamon and nutmeg and unripened green tomatoes, and has you making a pie that'll rival even the best apple ones you could find at bakeries. Green tomatoes have an especially great harvest during the fall, so that's when this dish would see the most mileage. You would find houses all over the South constantly making green tomato pies. And this specific pie is an example of how you don't need anything fancy to create something that can get everyone at the table. You know what's even funnier? This dish is one of the best things to come out of mock cooking because it was made to imitate mock apple pie and mincemeat pies. An imitation of an imitation ends up giving us something that was a big part of Southern culture. Who would have thought? Are you a big fan of deli food? Deli meats, sandwiches, loaves, that kind of thing? Then one of the best parts of that kind of eating was the olive loaf. It was usually made with pork and beef plus chopped green olives, which is what it became known for. There was a small, brief period before convenience foods started taking over America, where processed meats were really becoming a thing, and this dish was a big part of that time, which arguably spanned all over the 1940s to the 1970s. It had an extremely loyal fan base too, as this was responsible for many deli counters still staying in business. These days, you could find retro stalls that still do a mean olive load, But the days where this was a commonplace item on the street and something you'd see your grandma cooking up are long gone in America's history. People definitely remember the flavors of the bologna, the ham loaves, and all the amazing dips they came with, though. Speaking of cakes, hot water cornbread was also a not-so-close but close enough alternative to your regular layered delights. It was made in a pan, and the batter was shaped into cakes before being fried in hot fat to add that iconic crisp that nothing else had. Seriously, this thing gave fried chicken burgers a run for their money in retrospect. Then some salt and boiling water was all you needed. It had a perfectly crisp exterior that crumbled in your mouth perfectly, while the inside was tender, warm, and very reminiscent of Grandma's cooking. Probably why it caught on as much as it did, since most of these ingredients managed to get the long end of the stick with inflation. So, peanut butter stuffed baked onion might sound strange, but trust me, it's worth a try. We're taking a whole onion, hollowing it out, and stuffing it with peanut butter. Then, we're going to bake it until the onion is caramelized and sweet. It sounds like an odd pairing, but the salty, creamy peanut butter and the sweet onion actually complement each other really well. This dish was a unique way to combine protein and vegetables. It might not be everyone's cup of tea, but it was a clever way to make a filling meal out of inexpensive ingredients. Plus, onions were a staple in many households because they were stored well and added flavor to almost any dish. It was one of the more outlandish food recipes to come out of the Great Depression, and food historians Andrew Coe and Jane Ziegelman, authors of A Square Meal, are certainly no fans. So am I. Smoked picnic ham with brown sugar was another really inexpensive way to stretch ingredients without breaking the bank. You might not know, but refined sugar actually pretty much became a myth in homes back then. In more bougie neighborhoods, sure, you'd pop open a cabinet and see some sitting pretty. But for everyone else, that just wasn't the case. Refined sugar was a rarity and also an expensive ingredient to buy. Brown sugar, on the other hand, was the perfect fix. Cheap, available easily, and barely distinguishable, it was the backbone of a lot of wartime cooking. Also, the smoked picnic ham isn't really authentic either, at least not in the way you're thinking. Ham usually is made from the hind leg, but picnic ham is cured, and it's cut out of the shoulder. It's got mostly the same texture, but it's a bit on the cheaper side because it's tougher and has a higher fat percentage, which wasn't really a bad thing. I mean, the people were definitely lacking some of that in their diet. Smoked picnic hams with brown sugar were most regularly made around things like Thanksgiving and Christmas. It was a nifty little way to make everyone feel like they were celebrating. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. Carrot marmalade came to the rescue when gelatin and popcorn weren't doing much for the taste buds. Now, marmalade usually involves citrus fruits, but during the Dust Bowl, folks had to get creative. This was a pairing that ensured nothing went to waste in the kitchen, including carrots that had slightly gone bad. This wasn't just a treat, but it was a way to preserve the sweetness in fresh fruits and vegetables because fresh produce was hard to come by. This marmalade was made by boiling carrots with sugar and a bit of lemon juice, creating a spread that could be used on bread or biscuits. Plus, carrots are packed with nutrition. Carrots are packed with antioxidants like beta-carotene and lutein. These compounds have protective effects against oxidative stress and inflammation. If you believe that eating insects is a modern, sustainable practice, you are wrong. In the Dust Bowl, crispy fried grasshoppers were not a joke. They were a staple food. During the poor harvests, and when meat was hard to come by, farmers looked to the hordes of grasshoppers feeding on the crops. Talk about revenge dining. Hunting grasshoppers was a family event, and when you had gathered enough grasshoppers in a bucket, then the cooking process started. They were washed, marinated, and then fried to a crisp golden brown. The result? A crunchy snack that contained protein and was not too shabby if one didn't consider what they were consuming. Grasshoppers are in fact a form of superfood as they contain high protein, iron, and good fats. The Dust Bowl families were not consciously trying to innovate, but they were able to feed themselves in a way that many others could not. Also, if you fry anything, it automatically becomes at least 50% tastier, doesn't it? Nowadays, insects are being considered as a source of food, but in the past, crispy grasshoppers were a means of feeding oneself. Let's not forget all the times a well-made bacon and onion sandwich made the difference between an exhausting, bland day and one with a warm and welcome surprise. Most people would be real cautious with their bacon, as the days of simply frying up a few strips and eating them as is were gone. You had to make each cut of meat count, especially bacon. While it was still attainable on average, its new prices were not doing anybody any favors. So people would dice up some onions, sauté them until they were that perfect golden brown, and make the bread themselves. Sometimes out of stuff like sawdust when dough would not be available, and there you had it. A perfectly vitalizing sandwich ready to put the spirit back into your tired body. Grandmas had this perfected down to a science, as they seem to have developed a natural intuition for how much bacon, salt, and onions a good sandwich needed. Drop a comment with your favorite, hit like if you enjoyed the journey, and subscribe so you never miss another taste of history's forgotten tables.